QuickBooks Pro Plus Desktop 2022 Homepage Overview. Get ready because we bookkeeping pros are moving up the hilltop with QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2022. In prior presentations, we got the QuickBooks software up and running on our system, indicated by the QuickBooks icon on the desktop. If you don't have the software up and running, you could take a look at those prior presentations. We also set up the QuickBooks sample file in a prior presentation, that being the data file we'll use to practice in the navigation half of the course. In the second half of the course, we'll start a new company file. Good idea to know where your data file is located. We placed our data file in this folder in the example, and it's under the data file for us. The data file looks like this. The software looks like this. So notice you can open the data file by either double-clicking the software, or you could double-click the data file itself. Most people actually open the software first and then go to the data file within the software, especially if you're working in a company type of setting, always using the same data file. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to double click on the software program. This being similar to double clicking on, say, a Microsoft Word program or a Microsoft Office program. Then we need to make sure that it links to the proper data file. If we were using the data file that we always use, it would oftentimes open up that data file directly. However, here, due to the fact that we're using a sample file, it will still take you to basically this screen, that last file that we had open being up top here, that we can then open from this this company file screen. So I could double click on this. Also note that if I hover over this item, that gives us that mapping to see where the actual data file is located, so you know where it's actually at. So you can then click on this one. We can open it here, or you can click the open button in the blue, that then opening up the data file. We have then our warning saying, hey, look, this is a sample file. This will not be there when we do not have the sample file, but it will be there as long as we're using the sample file. Also note that the color scheme's a little bit different. They changed this in the settings, meaning that this top bar is a little bit lighter than the default settings that you would have if you just set up a new company file. So if you're comparing this to your company file and you have the latest version of QuickBooks, then just note that this a darker blue because of the settings related to the coloring. So I'm going to then, when we open this up, we've got the home tab that will then open up in the middle. So you can kind of drag this around here in the middle. I'm actually going to close it right now so you can see what it looks like without the home tab. I'm going to close this up. This would be the setting with no windows open. So in essence, you've got this whole gray area, which will basically display anything that we're currently looking at: invoices, bills, the reports, and so on. And then we've got the drop downs up top, which might be a format you'd be used to if you use like Microsoft Office a ways back before they went to the ribbon format up top. You got these drop downs. And then on the left hand side, you also have another screen that gives you some more settings that you could be using. It opens by default to the shortcut settings here, but I usually like to see my open windows and then use the drop downs. So what I'm going to do most of the time when I go into the software is go to the View tab, and then go to the View Open Windows. This Open Windows pane then will show you anything that's open in this middle frame, and we can have multiple things open, and then you can basically you can toggle between the open frames that will then be displayed in this middle area here. The typical open screen that we'll be starting out with will typically be that Home Page tab. So then you can open the home page back up by going to the company dropdown and then going to this home page. The home page is a great visual icon that we can have because it gives us the flows that we'll go through by cycle. So we'll take a look at those cycles here. Also note that on the left-hand side, now we've got the home page that has opened on the left-hand side, can toggle back and forth. You can also maximize the screen. If I hit this maximization of the screen, it will maximize to this gray area. So I can maximize this screen, and then it maximizes in that gray area. Now you got to be careful with these two items up top that look the same. If you, for example, click on this X, it will close the program, whereas this X will close the home screen. If I select this item, it will take it from maximized to less than maximized within the gray area of the screen. So typically what you're going to be doing is usually having the home page open if you're working from the home page until you get used to the software, which at that point you might prefer to use, say, the drop downs up top. It might be a little bit faster to maneuver, and then you don't need the home page open. You will often also typically have your reports open at the same time. That would be, say, the balance sheet and the income statement. I'll open them now just so we can see how they'll show up in the open tabs. You can go to the reports dropdown, for example. There's a few ways to do this. We'll talk more about this later. We go to the company financials. We could take then let's go to the balance sheet down here. The balance sheet and the P&L, the profit and loss, are the two reports that make up the major financial statement reports. Balance sheet standard. You can see once again, this opens up in our window. So I can drag this around in this gray area. And I can see my two windows. I can toggle back and forth between them. Or I can maximize these two and toggle between them with my open windows on the left side. So there's going to be one report that's a common report that we will be looking at. The other one, reports drop down, company and financial. Let's take a look at the income statement, which is also called the profit and loss standard report. And so there's our profit and loss standard report. Now I'm going to go through these and simply maximize the screen. So I'm going to maximize the screen. You note the date range that they're putting into the date range by default. You can make this maybe at the beginning of the year. We'll take a look at the full year on January 1st. And then I'll go to the balance sheet. This has just the one date, which is basically the ending date on the balance sheet. We'll talk more about that later. I can make that full screen, and then I could toggle over here to the home tab. So now this is generally the point that I would have open when I open up the software. I'll open up the open windows, I'll maximize the screens, and then I typically like to toggle through the open screens with the data in essence on the left-hand side. If I want more space, then more real estate in terms of my area that I'm looking at, I can minimize this screen up top with this collapse arrow. And so I'll collapse the arrow. And there we have that. We can uncollapse it by going here, uncollapse, and collapse. That's the general type of layout. So then in terms of functionality, what are we going to actually be doing with data input? The data input can basically be thought of by breaking it down by section, by cycle, rather than just in essence by date of how you're going to enter the transactions. So they have a nice visual here to give us the kinds of forms that will be used on a cycle by cycle basis. So we'll look at this in terms of an overview, and then we'll go back into it and look at each of these cycles in more depth, going into each of the forms that will be within it. But the general idea will be that you'll have a cycle that will include types of forms that will be included, those forms then being things like the bills that will enter, the pay bills, the create invoice, and the receive payment, and so on and so forth. If you've worked with formal accounting in terms of a journal entry type of format, then you could think about the journal entries that would be entered and compare them to the software, which will typically be set up so that these forms will drive the most common types of journal entries that you will be entering into the system. So in other words, every form just about will be a process that enters some type of journal entry, basically having two accounts that will be impacted, that will then help us to create or generate the financial statements. So what we would like to do in the accounting system is break down the accounting system into, in essence, cycles, and then every process that's going to have a repeated type of process, we would like to break that down into a particular form, like an invoice, receive payment, create sales receipt, and then make the data input into those forms as easy as possible, as straightforward and standardized as possible, so that we can have possibly separate people doing the data input into those forms, those forms then entering the transaction, the journal entries, in order to create the financial statements. That's the general idea. Now note that how much of a full service bookkeeping system you might have, meaning how much of this full flows in these three sections you will be using, will depend on the size of your business. If you have a smaller business and you're saying, look, really what I want to do is just basically create my books, in essence mirroring my bank statement. I'd like to use possibly the bank feeds to bring in the bank feeds and allow them to create my financial statements. You can do that kind of system as well. In essence, you can basically link to the bank, use the bank transactions to try to put together your financial statements, but you're still going to have an understanding of these forms, because these are going to, in essence, be the driving forms to help you to take that data and put it into the QuickBooks system. So realize that how complex your system will be will depend on what your needs are. If you were to take your information and construct it just simply from the bank, then you're not really using a full service bookkeeping system. You're relying on the bank's data to pull in and create the books. And as we go forward and look at these processes, we'll talk about, when that might be an appropriate approach and when it wouldn't. We're going to go through here with a full service kind of accounting approach and discuss when we're breaking away basically from a cash basis to an accrual basis and why, and that kind of system. And then if you can peel away and say, hey, look, I don't need that much detail in my particular system. I don't need to track or have that information. I want to be more in a cash basis system, for example, on one of these cycles. Then you can apply that method as it might be appropriate for your particular bookkeeping needs. So the sections here, we're going to be breaking them out to vendors, customers, and employees. These are common sections that you might see when you're actually working in an accounting field, meaning if you have a larger company and you have a separation of duties, then you're typically not going to be working on everything at one time. You will typically be working within some particular department, possibly a department that deals with, the vendor, the purchasing type of side of things, where you're on the purchasing, cash is going outflow for purchases in some way, shape, or form, or you're working on the customer side of things. Either you're on the sales side of things, creating the sales invoices as you make sales, and or the collection side of things, you're trying to collect, say, on receivables that have been issued, for example. And then we have the banking information working on, in essence, depositing and so on. And then you might be in the payroll section. Payroll is kind of a specialty area. Sometimes that's within a company. If it's a larger company, it might have its own payroll department that handles the payroll, and or they might be outsourcing the payroll department and have a human resources department possibly that works with some other company like an ADP or Paycheck that in essence handles the payroll, but then you might work in a payroll area. The funny thing is that smaller companies, if you do bookkeeping for a smaller company, then you are more likely to be doing a lot more of these things because there's not going to be as much separation of duties. If you are sole proprietor, then you're going to be doing possibly all of these things. Now, the trade-off is that as a company gets larger, then there's going to be a lot more detail within each one of these kind of needs that are going to be in place, and therefore you will specialize in one of those things. You will also have separation of duties because the internal controls will be such that you cannot fully rely, you don't want to fully rely on one person as the business grows. So you're going to have a separation of duties. Smaller companies can't do that. You can't do the separation of duties because you don't have the staff to do that. So one person or less people end up doing more of the full functions. So the trade-off when you're looking at this from a working standpoint is actually, if you're working at a smaller company, you're probably going to be doing more stuff, but they won't be as in-depth in terms of the different kinds of things you're doing as a larger company. If you work at a larger company, you are far more likely to be specialized into one particular thing, but that one particular thing could be quite a lot more nuanced. Usually that specialization that you will be compensated for specializing typically with a higher salary as you specialize. That's kind of the trade-off. You'll specialize more, and that special need may then generate that higher salary as well. So that's the general trade-off. So the sections that we will then be looking at in the future are going to be the vendor section, the customer section, and the employee section. The vendor has with cash outflow ultimately. The bill is an accrual kind of component. The pay bills is when we pay it. That's when the cash goes out. You can also think about just basically checks going out. We'll talk about that more later. We've got the customer cycle, the sales process, the invoice. That's when the sale takes place. Receive payments. You're receiving payment on account, or you simply create a sales receipt, kind of like what would happen at a cash register situation, depositing that then into the bank. And then the employee side would be the processing of the payroll and paying the payroll taxes and so on. Once you have an understanding of the flow this way, you can find much of these same things by going to the drop downs up top. So you can go to the drop down in the customer section, create an invoice and so on from the drop downs. Some people really like the flowchart. I still like the flowchart even though I'm pretty competent with it. Some people, once they understand what's going on, don't like the flowchart because they don't like to have another window open possibly, and they prefer to just be using the drop downs. So that's going to be a basic overview. What we'll be doing in the future is going through each of these sections one by one, taking a look at the primary forms that are going to be used. These forms are the forms that are there because those are the transactions that happen most of the time on the most frequent way, how we can set up those forms, and how those forms then will be used to create the financial statements. And that's really a key point where a lot of people don't have as much knowledge about, where you could possibly stand out from the crowd. In that case, every time you do a data input, you want to be thinking what is actually happening to the financial statements, and then go back to the financial statements and actually verify that that is indeed what has happened, because that'll give you the understanding of what is happening, so that if there is a problem, you are more likely to be a person that can fix it. And when you're setting up the QuickBooks system, then you need to be able to understand these things in order to set them up properly. Once things are set up properly, the idea would then be that these day-to-day transactions can be done by someone that does not have as much skills that could just do simply doing the data input part of the process, even if they don't know how to set up, say, the forms and or what the impact on the financial statements will be.